Hi everybody, this is Bob Gluschow again, and my lecture today is about describing service systems. Service systems is a term you've probably heard many times already in this course, and you'll hear it many times again. And there's a very precise definition that people who talk about the design of services are now using as a value co-production configuration of people, technology, and services connected by value propositions and shared information. And that's really useful once you understand it, but it's actually a pretty new definition. And we've tried to talk about services for many years, and both in formal, academic, professional ways, as well as in more kind of common sense ways. And my talk today will be to talk about some work I did to compare you might say the normative or academic or professional views of how to describe service systems with the way that sort of ordinary people would describe them before they've studied service design. I'm going to use as the example the BART system in the Bay Area Rapid Transit system. And I'll talk about that, and I will talk about what that tells us about how we should teach service design. A lot of this work was reported in a paper I wrote called Describing Service Systems a couple of years ago. A lot of field study services, and so they have to have ways to talk about them. In management schools, operations schools, informatics departments, all of these academic fields have ways of talking about service systems. And each of them looks at the system in a slightly different way because they have their own conceptual framework and methods that they apply to the design of services. And so they can be thought of as different perspectives or points of view on service systems. There are many of these. I'm going to describe the four most common ones, beginning with physical or topological description, which really says how does it physically, how is it laid out? What's the spatial arrangement of the parts of the service system? Experiential framework is one that tries to capture the way a service customer moves through the service system through a number of touch points or service encounters with the service provider. A functional or process view is more abstract and tries to define the service system in terms of the various pieces of activity or functions that take place in the service system to create value. And finally, there are lots of approaches to describing services that are more data-driven or simulations which try to more quantitatively analyze the way that the system works and maybe to predict how it would work in different situations. So beginning with this physical topological approach, I mean, this is one where you emphasize the physical layout of what's often called the servicescape, by analogy with the word landscape, where you say, how is the service presented to you? How do you interact with it? How is the layout of the various parts of the service system specified? If you think about this, if you consider the different experiences you have in a supermarket or a department store where you wait in lines, or where you have a more free-form kind of arrangement of the service providers, it really does affect your experience. And you can do a very precise kind of description of that. We could talk about the number and the layout of the lines, whether there are weight number systems or how the library stacks might be arranged, as a way to characterize how the different parts of the service system are physically laid out in space. A second description framework is this what we call experiential, and this uses much more fanciful, colorful language like the service journey or the experience cycle. Often this is chronological. It's often kind of a top-down view, maybe, of the service, where you can sort of follow a customer or service user through time as they interact with different parts of the system. So this might be one where you have an experience which plays out over some period of time. Maybe as a consumer of a service, maybe you buy something, you have a number of steps you have to go through. Or if you're in some going to Disneyland, you might say, how does the different steps of your experience at Disneyland? So you see how different places you go and have different kinds of experience. A particular flavor of a description of experiences is called the service blueprint. And this is a depiction which emphasizes very clearly the places called the touch point where the service provider and the service customer have a face-to-face encounter. At the same time, behind that front stage of the service, there might be a number of other layers where things are done that prepare the service provider to interact with the service customer. So you might have a service blueprint for something like a hotel stay, where the top row shows the point where the service customer and the service provider interact. So the point, you have a yellow box and green boxes here. Where they come together is where the rubber hits the road, you might say, where the service provider and the service customer are interacting. And each of those steps represents another touch point where something happens where the service provider interacts with the service customer. And the areas behind are more support processes or invisible processes, which are necessary in the design, but which are not directly visible in the service customer's experience. This idea of functional description looks at services in a different way. It says, let's think of the parts of the service system as functions or components or building blocks. And that lets us decompose the services into a bunch of pieces which might be rearrangeable in different service systems. So that abstraction might be look at parts of a bank or parts of a store, parts of a university in terms of departments or units or functions like that. And you can see how they are put together to define the service as it's exchanged. Now these vary a lot in their abstraction level. A good example is this one here of a bank, where you see a number of different activities that the bank undergoes to plan its activities, to plan how it is going to have different parts of the bank work together to create the value. And then you see these different parts where the bank's products and services are developed. And each of these boxes represents one part of that overall service system. And this particular diagram, the boxes are colored to assess some measure of how essential those are in the overall capabilities of the bank. And they might be places where the bank might want to have some of the provider provide that service for it in some kind of outsourced or third-party relationship. Process level descriptions are also a very important framework for describing service systems. This is where you have some sequence of processes and workflow, maybe some set of activities where various steps take place to create value. This is often very useful when you compare maybe an idealized view of a process and the actual one, what we might call the as-is or the to-be models of the process. You could compare a process like filling out a claim. When you say you have a car accident, there's a number of steps that take place between you and the insurance company, where you have to first submit the claim gets validated, the insurance company decides whether they're going to give you a benefit or not, then you have some kind of discussion about that, you may negotiate what the claim is, and then you close the claim. And you can look at these different steps and see how you're interacting with the service provider, but it's not in terms of places like you saw in service blueprints or the more experiential ones, but this is in terms of functions that take place between you and the service provider. And finally, we have a number of frameworks for describing service systems, which we might call data-driven. These are, again, often highly mathematical. You might be fitting simulations or various kinds of functions that you fit the data of some actual service systems you've observed, and then try to come up with a model that you can simulate how different changes in the service system might affect the outcomes. So an example here of this simulation model characterizes a very famous paper by Oliva and Sterman that looks at the way in which employee satisfaction affects the value in a service system. And you see various kinds of interactions between the way in which the employees are working, the pressure on them in terms of the expectation of how hard they have to work and their scheduling and so on, whether they have been trained effectively and so on. And these different kinds of value stores of some kind interact and increment, and you can then predict the implication if you were to change something like the schedule of the employees. So these frameworks are looking at a very different number of issues. Some of them look more at the organizational level in a conceptual way, like simulations. Some look at the organizational level in a very spatial or topological way, like the spatial maps. Others look at the processes in a more granular way. Others even look at the very precise information that is being exchanged, either in a conceptual way or in a very literal way in terms of, say, the messages that are passed between the customer and the provider. So with that as the background, as the way we teach service description in various academic fields, what do people actually do? So I did an experiment in my class at Berkeley where I essentially asked my students to talk about BART. This is the first day of the semester. They hadn't studied services yet. And I wanted to see how an untrained person would look at this problem of service system description. So many of you may be familiar with the BART. It's the public transit system of trains over the Bay Area, 104 miles of track, a number of different lines. The core service is moving people around through the electric trains, but there's a number of things around BART that people view as part of the BART system. You have a parking lot, you have ways to store your bikes, you can buy different kinds of things in the BART station and so on. And the question was, how do people understand this as a system? So again, I had people describe BART, and I said, just try to describe it different ways that would give you be able to communicate different perspectives or points of view on the BART system. And this is before any of them had ever studied services. Again, it was the first week of my course at Berkeley. Most of them were graduate students studying information design or engineering or management, and which means, of course, they come from different points of view already in their undergraduate training. And the astonishing thing was that they did essentially very different things. I mean, I suppose maybe it was not that unexpected, but essentially there was more variety than I imagined. They took their previous academic background and tried to apply what they might have learned in an industrial organization or in business to this new field of service design they were interested in. And they invented a lot of hybrid kind of representations that had hints of the more normative or academic frameworks, but which really were quite innovative. The most typical thing they did was describe a kind of hybrid of the physical or topological description of the service system with a more touch point kind of representation like the blueprints, but arranging them so in a literal manner. So you have a blueprint which has an abstraction, but you have it laid on top of the physical world. And that, again, as you'll see in a minute, it's a very interesting kind of representation that captures some very useful properties of the BART system. But of course, there's a lot of variation in scope. And one thing that was quite interesting was whether you thought the BART system was the network of stations and trains, or whether you thought it was a larger kind of system that fit in your whole way of getting around the Bay Area, where you might have viewed the BART as part of a more multimodal train system. If you live in Berkeley, you may have to take a bus to the BART station, or ride your bike to the BART station. And how does bike and bus and train all fit together in this larger service system? Depends on your point of view, and again, that's part of what the different representations captured. So here's a really good example of that kind of topological touch point. If you look at this diagram, you see a kind of map of the BART system in a way. You have the area around the BART station, you go into the station, you get on the train, and then you get off the train. And we're sort of seeing that kind of physical layout, but you're also seeing these kinds of touch points where you buy a ticket, you have to get through the turnstile, you have to do other things, look at the various kinds of information displays that helps you figure out where to go. So you have this kind of hybrid of these two representations. Another kind of representation that was quite innovative tries to capture the differences between the services that you see directly, that you interact with directly as a customer, with the ones that are there but are visible, like how the credit card gets processed if you buy a ticket and things like that, or how the trains are scheduled. You know it has to be there, part of the system, but you don't see it. So here you see this difference between what you see and what you don't see, and the student invented something called the line of visibility here to separate the things that they see and the things they don't see. And of course, at the top you see this kind of, again, a topology where you see as the BART experience progresses from being at home or in your office to getting on the train in the station and then getting off the train at the end of the ride. Here's the final one, which looks much more like the kind of componentized bank framework I showed you a few minutes ago, where they're trying to separate the functions of the BART system between those which involve physical contact and those which involve non-physical or information contact. And they're trying to organize them in terms of various kinds of domains, like ticketing, where you pay, and then where you information about the trains, and then actually the ride on the train. But again, you see there's this trying to impose a number of different organizational schemes on the parts of the BART system, none of which is exactly what they might have been taught in school, but they've now invented some very interesting hybrids. So what this tells us is something quite interesting, which is that people were quite intuitive at using some of these frameworks which there would be taught in school, and that probably means that the frameworks are pretty good, that we find ways to abstract some naturally occurring frameworks that make them more rigorous, which is what you'd expect a school to do. But at the same time, they were very inventive. They were not stuck or limited to one particular framework. They would try to invent kinds of hybrid or composite frameworks that complemented each other. And I think that's a very important lesson for us, that we shouldn't focus only on teaching one framework. We should even if we're in different departments, we should try to teach different kinds of frameworks to our students and encourage students to learn different frameworks, because you're going to find there's benefit in the kind of combination rather than just using them straight out of the box in the sort of standard way. Thank you very much.